join you for the unveiling of this extraordinary exhibition. I want to acknowledge that this is a really special exhibition. It's a mesmerizing encounter between art and light and technology, and it's going to turn the underside of the Gardner Expressway into a glowing horizon. I love the idea of using robotics and technologies to tell the story, to transform the space into a simulated sunset. And for me, this is a kind of an urban intervention that can help us all pause, reflect on the city's space, and be reminded of our deep connections to one another in the city. I'm particularly proud to support the incredible work at the Bentway. It's an organization that I think is doing leading and exemplary work and really is holding space so that we can explore what's happening in the arts and our public spaces. It is truly possible to reimagine public space, not just as a site for art and creation, but as a way to bring people together and to build community and to spark new conversations about the kind of city that we want to live in. Under the Gardner, the Bentway continues to prove that public space can be truly imaginative and inclusive and inspiring. So a huge congratulations to the team at the Bentway, to Quayola, to Videochita, and the entire creative team for bringing this extraordinary work to life. It's truly a world-class installation, and it will be making magic in our streets in our city. I can't wait to see how others experience this, and I hope that you are able to take the show in and bring a friend and come back for more. Like, we need to be supporting the arts and our city and all of the magical things that make it so special. So thank you so much to the Bentway for this extraordinary work.
Thank you so much. We're so excited to have you here with us tonight. Okay, without further ado, and I'll let these people file in and grab their seats, lots of room. Without further ado, I'm so pleased to introduce you to Quayola, an artist whose work explores the space between the real and the virtual, the handmade and the machine-made. Through robotics and algorithms, he reimagines canonical imagery, landscapes, and architecture through contemporary technology. Traditional landscape painting, classical sculpture, and iconography are some of the historical aesthetics that serve as a point of departure for his hybrid compositions. His varied practice, all deriving from custom computer software, also includes audiovisual performance, immersive video installations, sculpture, and works on paper. And his works have been performed and exhibited in many prestigious institutions worldwide, including the V&A in London, the Park Avenue Armory in New York, Palais de Tokyo in Paris, and the Sundance Film Festival, to name just a few. So please help me and give a warm welcome to Quayola.
Hello.
Hello.
Maybe this one. Yeah, I decided to show you a lot of things, but solar, because I thought maybe solar, you would see it. But I remember studying art when I was a kid, say the first art school I did, like in the 90s in Rome. I remember studying composition of historical paintings. There were these kind of exercises that they let us do, where on one side there were sort of analyses of iconographical themes, but on the other side there were these kind of compositional analyses. There were these very analytical ways of describing a painting. And in order to do that, you really need to look beyond that kind of iconographic layer, that kind of historical layer. It's quite a difficult exercise somehow. Sometimes they used to let us flip the painting in order not to get distracted by that. So the idea really of looking at something sometimes so familiar, but with a different pair of eyes, is really something that sort of stuck with me and continues to be something really present in my practice. Let's say if we fast forward maybe 25 years, a bit more, maybe since then, we also live in a very different world today, where this kind of mediation, this kind of different types of observation is constantly brought on us by technology. Technology becomes a context, becomes a sort of different pair of eyes that provide us a new readings of reality. And I love, of course, the excitement of how technology projects us onto the new. That's what drove me to technology in the first place, in the beginning. But I also love how technological processes can perhaps provide, new readings, also things that we are very familiar with. And really, this is something that it's probably the core of my practice, to ultimately deal with historical, I wouldn't say references, like historical practices, almost some kind of traditions. And I love to see my work sometimes fitting almost as a continuation of some of these historical traditions. These that you see on the screen here are some unfinished sculptures from Michelangelo back in the Renaissance. And these objects have always been an incredible source of inspiration for me. The fact they were left unfinished sort of really shifted the focus of what the real subject of these works is, which is not the figure anymore. It's really the articulation of matter in itself. These objects are sort of hybrid objects in which you have this kind of thin line between representation and abstraction, between form and matter, and also somehow to me are really the symbol of an object that documents the process of its creation. I'm really obsessed with the idea of the work that it's a documentation of a process, someone that is embodying this process. So I've done many experiments sort of studying classical sculpture in a way, some of these dynamics, some of these kind of torsions. I was really interested in how those unfinished sculptures were almost fighting between these kind of torsions, this sort of energy, and these unfinished blocks of matter. So I spent some time with these Greek or Roman fighters to really explore and trying to understand some of these dynamics. And then sort of experimented and figure out a way of kind of transforming these dynamics, these geometries, these moving geometries onto data. So using sort of special photogrammetry rigs, I would sort of arrange these kind of Greco-Roman fights within those, and the resulting geometry then would become a sort of starting point for me. I spent a really long time trying to figure out sort of my own way of sculpting, or let's say documenting new forms of sculptural gestures. I keep saying gestures when I do these presentations. It's becoming kind of more frequent. I think I'm realizing that maybe my work really is a lot to do with gestures, with documenting gestures that maybe are not related to the kind of human limb, but still to me are incredibly personal gestures that simply embodies in different ways through these technological processes. So I've been exploring a lot, these kind of computational systems in order to create subtractive processes, simulate subtractive processes, a bit like, sculptural processes where you would remove this material, you would program how to remove material bit by bit. And then this information that became instructions for these industrial robots that then can perform these operations. So essentially, my work on sculpture is not really in the development of a 3D model that then it is made somewhere. It is in the programming of the gesture itself. And in fact, my intent is not really to reproduce figures or historical sculpture, but rather to explore the gesture of the machine in itself, almost explore the space surrounding maybe this object, never really reaching them, as a pretext to really explore this kind of new robotic expressiveness, I guess. And during this process of experimenting with these machines, I realized that, of course, these hybrid objects were, focused, but also the machine in itself. And to really show the machine, to be able to exhibit the machine, essentially exhibit the process itself becomes this object of contemplation. And I guess I'm kind of slowly getting into something that aligns a little with what I'm showing here. I think everything I'm gonna talk about tonight, you will see then that kind of connects to what you will see. But again, my obsession, with tradition, with where these languages really come from, really got me thinking that ultimately I really wanted to work with real stone. Originally these experiments were done with quite light material, and until finally I managed to strike a really amazing partnership with an historical marble quarry in Carrara, where the same marble where the original statues that I showed you were made from. And so I started really spending some time there, selecting these big blocks and essentially applying the same processes using these machines, but to actually cut stone. So I love how, there is this really thin line between the physical world, the digital realm, and the physical one in my work. There is this kind of hybrid combination. You really bounce between one and the other. And although this object now, it's a physical sculpture, it's got nothing to do with a digital realm, but it is a documentation of that digital gesture. That gesture is written within that object. And another obsession of mine, besides cultural traditions, there are also pictorial traditions, and especially the traditions of landscape paintings. Okay, I really love how landscape painting always kind of became a way to discover new aesthetics. All the avant-gardes, all of the level of abstraction and new kind of visual languages that were developed throughout, the history of art were done by people that were really painting landscapes. Through this iterative observation of nature, then slowly new languages sort of arise. So I really love the idea of looking at some, dynamics, some behaviors, some landscapes, some natural patterns, and in doing so trying to kind of discover something new. So almost I put myself in the kind of shoes of the historical painter. I like to go out there, a bit like, this en plein air impressionist painter, but I do that with very different technological apparatuses. And so these observations are not only carried with my own eyes in the end and my own perception, but also the same things that I see, the same things that I experience are also captured using very different type of systems. And that, I guess, connects to a little bit those iconographic images that I was showing you in the beginning. Like, it's almost something that helps you to detach from that and reading it in a completely different way. Most of the times I use technologies that are not really meant to be doing what they do in my work. For example, like, what you see here on screen, or perhaps these industrial robots. And sometimes how I make work, there is no separation between the work and how I make work. Like, I love this idea of these sort of physical experiences where you go and experience certain phenomena, and then somehow this experience, it's turned into something else completely different. So there's quite a lot of these kind of strange expeditions that I go and try to find specific behaviors and patterns. And there was this project where I went to scout for these big storms, kind of following the paintings and the inspiration of Turner. I went back, in the sort of Atlantic coast of Cornwall, trying to look for those specific things, and again, through these storms, looking at different patterns, different behaviors, analyzing the motion of the sea, trying to understand how the sea it is moving, and then all of these data is then being used to essentially run these kind of pictorial simulations. I guess the fact of, this kind of primordial experience, of observing some sort of natural behavior, it's really something that we have in us in the end. So for me, the idea of creating these paintings is almost a way of creating these kind of objects of contemplation that refer to the very same experience as observing the landscape in the first place. And I guess this was really the sort of beginning of the inspirations that drove me onto solar. There is, of course, a huge tradition in landscape painting in studying light, how light hits objects, how light sort of behave. And I guess you could say this is also a primordial thing that we always had. I mean, the sort of contemplation of these phenomena, which is sunlight. So this really was the kind of beginning, the starting point for solar, and really sort of trying to create some kind of relationship between, the passing of time and so our perception of the sun, these kind of movements that we perceive on the sky, and how much light would change, within, the cycle of the day and so on. And so using these machines, I've been imagining that I could perhaps create this kind of imaginary path, try to really sort of represent the kind of motion, the passage of time using these machines, and then synchronize many rays of light, essentially a big array of lights. I mean, I thought maybe I shouldn't show you too much from it, but maybe a quick photo still, so it provides some context. So I guess there is a sort of orchestration, some kind of choreography of, this mechanical gesture that simulates, again, these patterns, these natural behaviors, and then these kind of endless sort of arrays that simulates different conditions. And as usual, in my work, really all of the works are the results of quite complex processes that sometimes last really long time, and in this case the same. We built quite articulated systems in order to technically be able to develop these. So it's kind of quite always satisfying when actually finally it works, because you don't quite know if it's really gonna work. And also these industrial machines, these are not machines to be taking around, the world by artists. So generally, yeah. So yeah, I mean, I hope you will make sense of all of these strange things that I talked about, but perhaps maybe when you would see the installation, everything will kind of come together. And for me, it's really important that ultimately everything I do, it's kind of interconnected with, one another. So whenever I have the chance to talk to an audience, I always want to try and provide a broader picture of what I do, and try not to spoil too much the installation. So thank you very much, and I'll see you later.
Thank you so much for sharing the work, giving us a bit of a teaser of what's to come. I'm going to start this conversation first by admitting that I am a sub tonight. Unfortunately, our creative producer of major projects, Alex Rand, who has really steered this project from conception to completion, was not able to take on this conversation, but I want to thank him and Stephanie Dudek and Vanessa Costa and all of the amazing team on the Toronto side.
You know, from my team, actually, quite a lot of thanks to all
Absolutely.
of the Pathway team and everyone here, because it's been quite challenging, you know, project, and without your amazing team, it would have been possible.
And likewise. So please, can we just give a round of applause to everybody? So I'm going to do my best to channel Alex in this conversation. But actually, I'd like to begin with a question. When we met here in Toronto, you mentioned to me that you've been working with computer software from a young age. And actually, we're very much inspired by your brother who studied architecture in the 90s, and not to date myself, but I may have started my architectural career in the 90s as well, so was familiar with the software at that time. But I'm curious how architectural practice and its tools have inspired your work today.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that architecture has been something that came in and out of my life in many different stages, and probably a very important source of inspiration that kind of drove me to do this and sort of continue to provide inspiration today. It started as my brother started studying architecture. He's 10 years older than me. So I was about, I don't know, maybe 11 when he started, bought a computer, and started buying all of these architecture books and cookies, remember we talked about. So I got really interested in kind of looking at these architecture books. And of course, when you look at a real architecture, when you look at a book, you have a certain kind of detachment in there, you know. And I really got in love with these books. And in these books, there were a lot of experiments, perhaps. For me, there was no difference between a photo of a real architecture or a photo of a model or a rendering of something. There were these kind of images that were experimenting, speculating with geometry, I guess. And you know, simultaneously, by looking at my brother, I started, you know, learning these computational tools of the time. I mean, quite rudimental CAD 3D software of the time. And I started using this computer a lot. I became actually quite good. In fact, I helped my brother doing the thesis renders, actually. And you know, I got so into it that it was kind of obvious, I think, for my brother and my family that I would start studying architecture. But actually, I was really convinced that I wasn't really interested in architecture. I was interested, in fact, in this computational space, that I could do things that didn't need to exist in the physical realm. They could not exist in the physical realm. And that, I think, so architecture has always been this kind of spark. It's almost like a way of thinking. There is, you know, it's a complex discipline that I love, because it's one of the few, I guess, creative disciplines that really deals with complexity. So that's what kind of got me started. And then in London, my best friend was also studying architecture at the Architectural Association, and so I started kind of getting into that world. And that world started getting quite a lot into my experiment, because maybe there were traces of these inspirations that you could read in the work. And so there's always been an interconnection with, you know, the academic, architectural, you know, academic circle, I guess, yes.
Yeah, often people ask me, so what is, now that you're not practicing architecture anymore, now that you work for the Bentway, and I say, well, am I not practicing architecture? I think that to really engage with a space like the Bentway, you have to be thinking spatially. And a project like Solar is so spatial. So I'm actually curious, you know, obviously this was a project that was designed to travel, and it's been shown in a different context already, but how have you adjusted the project? How has it responded to the site? It's concrete, it's monumental scale, it's surrounding neighborhoods. I'm very curious how it finds itself at the Gardner.
I think usually, even when I exhibit, you know, my video works, and sometimes video works that are simply a single channel video work, still there's a lot of work in trying to understand the space, and the space really, it's a big, you know, source ultimately that dictates what kind of experience you can do, and I think that there's a lot of responding to the space even when I'm showing something simple. So of course when you show something more complex like this, the space becomes really crucial. But this project, something that I forgot to mention, also marks this kind of strange milestone of being the very first project that I do with light. I never work with light. So usually I work with things that I have a bit more experience with in a way. So when I see a space, I already know exactly how things will be done and how. And this project has been, of course, quite challenging because yes, you can simulate things, you can try and get a grip, but ultimately, it's a bit, the hours of flight that counts, and with this type of. So I am very happy that I think there was some intuition that went in the right way. I think also I have to say that also the team at Bentway, we had a lot of conversations in trying to understand, to get a sense of the site. Also my sort of obsession for precision. I wasn't happy with the 3D model of the space that I had, so I arranged someone to do a new 3D scan of the space in order to. So there's been a lot of digital exploration of the space in order to, and now just yesterday we were trying to calibrate the lights that have nothing to do with the installations in the end, and I really try to bring this idea that you have the feeling of going under a highway. That's why we didn't use any sort of color light. I mean, beside the installation, in a way, we calibrated the lighting, and that I think was actually an important part of the experience. So sometimes only when you're there, you're able to make decisions, you're able to have the full picture.
Well, we are very excited to see a takeover of the Bentway spaces tonight. I mentioned that this project is a coda to our Sun and Shade season, and we've been exploring both these elements through many artistic projects, and really the way that our relationship to nature is changing in response to extreme heat. Now, nature is a familiar element in your work, but I read one of your quotes where you said that you're less interested in nature itself, and you're actually more interested in our tradition of observing nature and the way it has led us to create new aesthetics. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
I mean, the two things are somehow related. Let's say that in my work, I'm not really interested in the sort of lived experience, something that documents and try to show you things, mimicking how you see them, And this is why usually steps away from, let's say, the world as we live it. That's why I try not to make it into a comment about a specific problem that we might have. Of course, those metaphors can still be there, but really my work is about detaching completely from how you experience things. And I guess, this kind of detachment, this translation, is crucial. I think it's nice to detach from something to then distill it, transforming into something else. So my intent is not so much to mimic how the sunlight works or how these rays work. It's not some kind of scientific visualization. It's not something that is explaining you something. It is really like an object of contemplation. And in this sense, I think this tradition of these pictorial traditions of observing nature and getting that as a vehicle to discover new aesthetics, it's a very relevant thing somehow. So of course, yes, nature, it is an inspiration, it is the core of these, but I'm very fascinated, in these kind of traditions, and I love to see the work almost as a continuation of those historical traditions.
So we have to talk about the robot. I have such affection for this robot, and all of you will know what I mean as soon as you come to the space. We've spent a short period of time together, but there's real emotional attachment to this robot. And when I say robot, I'm sure most of you are thinking cold and mechanical, but you have this means of bringing emotion to these robotic devices. So can you speak a bit about how you imbue these devices with warmth, with humanity?
I'm also quite attached to the robot. This, in fact, is my second robot, and it's funny when you talk to my wife about this, that instead of buying home, I bought, robots. I think this becomes, it shows you how much, I am into this. It may work really. I think there is this contrast. You keep seeing, I think, in what I show you, this kind of strange tension between things that apparently they don't belong together, different time frames, different languages, different aesthetics, and so on. And I think it is important for me, not just the final thing, but that tension. And so I think the robot is not just the action that is performing, it's the symbol itself. It is this object, what, how it connects us suddenly to something, but then when you see it doing something completely different, then it creates this ambiguity, this strange tension. So to me, I think this is very important. And I think in order to do that, of course, you need these machines to then also act, not necessarily like a machine, So there's a lot of care in trying and figuring out how to, transform, I guess, this object, which ultimately, basically the robot are 6 numbers that move in time. There are 6 axes, 6 joints, and the programming involves moving these numbers over time. Basically, that's what you do in a way. So I think you can have analogies, ultimately of how you could move notes over time, or brush strokes over time, or so on. I think this idea of gestures, so time and gestures, you can see it, I think, throughout the work. And so there is an interconnection between everything here, between how you could move those keys on a piano, or so experiment with certain type of sequences that belong to one realm and then bring some of that into a different realm. But also, I think this idea of translating natural patterns, trying to mimic some of these natural complexities, is really part of what we explore in the studio, exploring mathematical functions that could be incredibly simple, but generate a lot of complexity. And I think it is within the fine calibration of those functions and the parameters that control those functions that the grace comes. So I think the grace comes from the details into the calibration somehow. I think that once I heard these things that really stuck with me, this example, what makes a difference between taking this kind of pre-recorded piano music, if you take a sonata from a famous composer, and you put the MIDI and you let it play in a computer, it sounds really dull. And then if you give this to a musician, then it sounds incredible. But then if you look at the data, if you would record what this musician is doing, and if you look at the data, the differences are actually quite small. They're just tiny differences in time, in velocity of these notes. If you could translate this numerically, the differences are quite tiny. It's in the details that you get this kind of expressiveness. And I think that's something I haven't quite maybe mentioned much. I talk a lot about this technology, but ultimately I think for me, the true special component, what makes everything special, what makes everything you, it's the human component. And that's got nothing to do with the technology, that's got nothing to do with the system. These are the decisions you make that are also the artistic gestures that ultimately, at the level of control, you don't know why, and that's, I think, so in this regards, yes, I think technology is there. It's not just a tool for me. It's almost like a collaborator. It's almost a context. But I think this human component, it is essential. And I love really to do this myself. I work a lot with engineers to help me develop crazy systems. But then really I try to spend the time to really calibrate those numbers myself, a bit like a musician would play with an instrument.
Well, in this case, the robot really does feel like an extension of your hand. You can see that level of detail and care in the piece. You're talking about tensions in your work, and I've also read that you've said that technology moves fast, but art takes time. So there's also a tension of speed, I imagine, in your work. And I'm curious how you reconcile that. I mean, clearly you're working across a historical tradition. A historical arc goes back a very long time. But how does the tension of time play out in a project like Solar?
I usually don't really think about these works as projects. These are these kind of really long-term obsessions, and long-term research and this kind of continuous research, it's very difficult to determine when something starts and when something stops. What I showed you in these presentations, they weren't projects, they were these fragments of these strands of research. So solar is, part of these strands of research. I mean, I guess it's kind of opening a slightly new branch, I would say, but still, so it's very difficult, I think, to take things out of context and saying, okay, how long this project did take. This project is built on experience of many other things that it wouldn't be possible because of that. And I really quite conservative in a way in how I employ new technology. I'm always hesitant, actually. I always apply brakes because I really want to be in control of the technology. I think I love that throughout the work that I've done, I don't know, in the last 20 years, you're able still to see me. Whatever the technology is that I'm using. And I think in order for this to happen, I think you need to be in control of that technology. So I think some of these processes, they take long times. I mean, it took me 10 years to figure out how to make those sculptures, with the robots. And I think this is maybe an initial step into trying to work with lights, although built on these robotic gestures. I think still it's a long way to go. So it's good to celebrate inefficiency, I think in making art, I guess. Of course, you use technology, you try and make efficient all of the things that could be made efficient, to then celebrate inefficiency. And I think to be able to spend 2 years thinking about how something should vibrate, or how maybe those leaves could be translated into those notes on a piano, or those waves, and then it takes time. And so sometimes you think about it for a year, and then maybe you start doing something, that you sit on it, and then suddenly there's like 5 years later, that thing slowly come to. So I love to celebrate that kind of pace. So usually also in a more practical sense, maybe in the studio, there is a bit of a separation between the works that I've made that very actively, very fast are deployed and go around. But then the research in making new works, it's actually really, really slow, and I try to keep the two things separate. So
I think that's an important lesson maybe for us all, to take the time to celebrate inefficiency. It's important. So we've talked about the site and we've talked about the technology, but just as we were waiting for people to arrive today, you said, well, now I get to see it with the audience, and that's when the project really comes to life. So can you talk about the role of the public in your work? What does it mean to work in public space? What role does the audience or to the participants play in the shaping the projects?
Well, on one side, my approach is quite selfish. I mean, in the end, these things, I really do it for me. They're really related to this obsession in the end, So I think I rarely think in a way that is audience related, in the sense, is this gonna be liked by the audience? Is it gonna work? Are they gonna like it? This is not kind of questions that I really tend to very dangerously ask, but I think somehow that makes it maybe work better in a way, because I think these obsessions then are your obsessions, and this is a documentation of ultimately what you do. But this enormous amount of work, that there is behind this project, all of this research, it wouldn't be feasible if you wouldn't have the satisfaction of showing people contemplating this. I mean, the amount of time, the amount of resources, the amount of energy that takes into developing these things. Not that you do it because it's fun. It's not that I go to the studio, I do this and it's fun. It's not fun. It's crazy.
It must be a little bit fun.
Well, but it's more like a tormented, strange thing in a way. I mean, when of course when you think about the robot, everything is fun. Then when you get this delivered, it's not fun anymore, And I think that there's so I think yes, the audience, it's what ultimately makes sense of it all. Okay, why do you do this? Yes, it's your obsession, but also it's something that has some kind of meaning that could be translated into an experience for people. And yeah, so finally we're here, so hopefully we get to that.
Well, I want to save some space for any questions that you may have, and admittedly, these lights are very bright. So it's very hard for me to see if anybody's raising their hand, but maybe Kate.
No, but maybe we can shift.
Yeah.
We can turn on the lights of the room. Or you can shout.
Hello, Quayola. Thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you for coming to Toronto. You mentioned that you are a very precise person. You want to make sure things